Shopping, planning, and cooking food really can be simple and stress-free. Imagine having your weekly shopping cart filled for you and your meals for the week decided on. Taking all of that work off my plate is why I love Hungryroot. Fall is in full swing, and between work, family, and everything else on my calendar, I'm trying to make life a little simpler. That's why I turn to Hungryroot. Hungryroot takes the stress out of mealtime by filling your cart with personalized picks and planning your week of meals, getting smarter with every order. With over 15,000 recipes to choose from each week, many ready in just 15 minutes or less, and a wide grocery selection, it's easy to find options that fit your whole family's tastes and nutrition goals. Last week, I had their yuzu baked salmon with asparagus, and it was absolutely delicious, light, flavorful, and ready in minutes. I didn't have to think, plan, or run out of ingredients. Hungryroot just knows what works for me and helps me eat well, even when life gets busy. Take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/Dr. Meg and use code Dr. Meg. That's hungryroot.com/Dr. Meg. Code Dr. Meg to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/Dr. Meg. Code Dr. Meg.
On today's episode of Parenting Great Kids,
our guest is Ray Alex Williams, once identified as a trans woman. Today, he shares his story of detransitioning.
You see this in like young men who they've been sold this idea that masculinity is toxic. They have a lot of insecurity about measuring up to these standards of masculinity. Like they're not like alpha men. They're maybe never had a girlfriend. They're nerdy. They're
Welcome to Parenting Great Kids. Here's your host, Dr. Meg Meeker.
Ray, I am so grateful that you're here. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm glad to have made your acquaintance on TikTok and happy to jump into these issues. I think this is a very important topic, particularly for parents. There's so much confusion these days and people just want to do what's right for their children. But yeah, a lot of misinformation about what that entails.
There is. So let's talk about you. Your journey was long and complicated and deeply personal. But for our listeners who may be hearing about you for the first time, can you just give us a brief overview and synopsis of your story?
Sure. I'll try and summarize it.
Okay, take your time.
So long story short, I transitioned when I was 28 years old. This was in 2015. This was in the trans tipping point. Caitlyn Jenner was in the news. It was a big thing in our culture at that time. You started to see more trans representation on like media. And I was in grad school at the time. I had just previously gotten divorced, and that was kind of the impetus that kicked off almost like a midlife crisis of some kind. And then prior to this, in terms of like what led to that decision, didn't just come out of nowhere. More particularly in my case, it had like a erotic component, a fetishistic component, and that was going back from a very young age. And we can get into like my own theories in regards to maybe what was going on in my childhood, whether nature or nurture. There's debates about these things, like why do children develop these interests? Because this was, prior to puberty, I had gotten interest in like stockings and like my mom would throw away pantyhose and I would steal it. So that started from a very young age, and then going through puberty, that sort of interest in cross-dressing became sexualized or eroticized to some degree or another. And then as I got older into high school and things, I got exposed to pornography. And that was also I think a developmental impetus for how this sorts of like erotic targets got imprinted in my brain. And so when I was in my 20s, this is sort of something I did in secret. It was like, as I said, it had this explicitly erotic component. And then as the theory goes, these sorts of paraphilias, they escalate over time. You sort of need more and more until eventually it got to the point where I was seeing a therapist at the time. We started talking about this, and given that Caitlyn Jenner was in the news, Caitlyn Jenner also had a lifelong history of secretive cross-dressing, and Caitlyn was supposed to be this, the example par excellence of what it means to be a trans woman in our culture. But I had never thought that, hey, I may be trans, because I didn't particularly hate my body or anything like this. And I should also mention that there's multiple different pathways into a transgender identity. My pathway is just one pathway, and also the pathway that girls go down is different than the pathway that boys go down. We can talk about those differences as well. So whether these sorts of feelings come on early in life, later in life, in midlife. So there's lots of different causal pathways. But essentially, one of the primary pathways for men to develop these feelings is essentially the theory called autogynephilia, which is essentially you are attracted to women, but then somehow that attraction to the feminine becomes inverted upon yourself, such that you're attracted to the idea of yourself becoming feminine. And that is essentially kicks off this fantasy, which is why it's incredibly common in transgender communities. Prior to trans identification, the vast majority of trans women, they ask themselves the question, am I trans or is it just a fetish? And then you have these online environments where they are encouraging basically like, hey, if you're struggling with this question, then the only explanation is that the reason why you developed this kink, why you developed this sexual interest, is because you were born a woman on the inside. You were born that way. You've always been that way. And you just developed all this stuff as a coping mechanism for that repressed gender identity. And this ideology sort of like very readily causes men to go down that pathway.
As a physician, listening to you talk, it makes so much sense, because when you develop this fetish when you're a kid and it goes into your teen years and you think about brain development, it changes your brain structure. And like I said, it sort of imprints on it and it grows and grows. And then if you're involved in pornography, it continues to grow. And so that's where, I think, trans people genuinely feel like they're the opposite sex because their brain has been wired to believe that. And then it's supported in the community. How did your marriage fit into all of this?
So my first marriage, she knew I was a crossdresser. She knew this was something that I did like in the privacy of the bedroom, something like when she was like out of town for the weekend or something. But it was always sort of relegated to that kind of private thing in the bedroom. And I kind of knew she wasn't like super into it, but she kind of tolerated it. And then for a variety of other reasons, I don't know if these are all unrelated, but our marriage fell apart partly due to the fact that she had been cheating on me, and then we kind of tried to open things up, and that didn't work, and then she eventually left me for someone else. And but it was at that moment of when she said she wanted a divorce. Kind of the first thought in my mind, one of the first thoughts was, but despite being really sad about that, was sort of this knowing in the back of my head this like opportunity to cross dress would now going to present itself, because at that point I had like resigned to suppress these feelings I had, because we kind of talked about like, hey, would you ever want to transition? And because I knew she didn't want that, she wasn't into that, I basically said no, not interested in that. And so I just kind of pushed those feelings beneath the surface, because I had this model that, I wanted to sacrifice my feelings for like the sake of my marriage. But when she announced the divorce, that kind of just blew open the lid, and I didn't have any, we didn't have any children. I was in grad school. I didn't have any responsibilities, and it was like a very liberal university. So it was like from my perspective, it's a good opportunity. So there's pretty much no barrier in my pathway. And that's kind of what kicked it off. And in addition to that, the cultural zeitgeist at the time in 2015, this was like very big in the culture. And there was really like no other option if you were a man who wanted to cross dress. That was sort of like the primary script we have in our society for, how men can be feminine in some way or to be gender nonconforming, it was, at least in that time, much more socially acceptable to be, hey, I'm a trans woman than it is like, hey, I'm a crossdresser.
When you were young and you were cross-dressing and you were pre-pubertal, did anybody know? Oh, your mother did.
Yes, I did get, I mean, I managed to keep it secret for quite some time, but I did get caught when I was younger, and I got grounded. I should have mentioned my parents are very religious, and I grew up homeschooled. So I think that kind of conservative religious environment maybe played a role, but I do sort of, I was never really big on the concept of like childhood trauma, because I felt like overall, like my childhood was very good. Could have been much worse, but I sort of been thinking like that like moment of like getting caught. Like I remember just like heart pounding, just like this fear moment
It's
in preaching.
shameful. It's shameful.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that word, because this concept of shame plays a big deal in the development of autogynephilia and the development of transgender identity, particularly in like young boys and like young men's feeling like that they like have these desires to cross dress, and they don't know where they come from. They feel shameful about it. It's very much policed in amongst other boys. You know, you don't want to be made fun of as like a sissy. And trying to find acceptance among other boys for your masculinity. I was never really like super effeminate as like a young boy. But there was still some sense in which I do feel like there is somehow a kind of masculinity wound, a gender wound, where I don't feel like I lived up to the masculine expectations of like my father, for example. He was very into like cars, mechanics. He was a handyman, like DIY fixing things. And I was not very mechanically interested, nor interested in like cars or things of that nature. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately, about sort of these family dynamic causes for gender issues in men. And I do think it often comes down to having a kind of emotional distance with your father. I think that's a big, I see that pattern all over the place amongst men who struggle with gender issues, being overly close with your mother and like emotionally distant from your father. I see that very common.
And yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, I kind of want to back up. You're painting an amazing picture and giving me, and I know everybody else, tremendous insight. You mentioned autogynephilia,
Yes.
AGP. What is that, and how does that? Many assume that gender dysphoria is. Can you sort of unpack that and what that has to do with gender dysphoria?
Yes. So the term is called autogynephilia. It means the love of oneself as a woman. And it's basically a term to describe the psychological process I mentioned earlier, where essentially you are attracted to women. So you're heterosexual, you love women, but then that love of women becomes turned upon yourself, such that you're aroused at the idea of yourself being a woman. So and that has different components. So you could be aroused at the idea of a woman insofar as you're taking on or embodying their clothing, their physical characteristics, their physiological characteristics, their mannerisms, their behavior, like how they're treated, how they're perceived. So it's a very like diverse phenomenon, and not everyone has all different respects. For some autogynephiles, it's only focused on the clothing. That's the more transvestic forms, and other ones it's focused on like anatomy. And so once you focus on the anatomy, who are more likely to develop dysphoria about their genitals and go on to get the more extreme surgeries. Now, the origin of this theory comes from a researcher clinician named Dr. Ray Blanchard. He was working in a gender clinic in the late 1980s. And amongst the males, the transsexual males who were coming into his clinic seeking these services, he noticed that there's kind of two broad camps of why a man might seek out these transsexual reassignment protocols. And he distinguished between these two broad camps. On the one camp, you have men who have been effeminate homosexuals from a very young age. So basically, from a very young age, they were very effeminate and they've been exclusively attracted to men. For these men, they developed a transgender identity and the dysphoria basically as a way of coping with the fact that they are extremely effeminate homosexual men, and that if you're interested in dating men as a young effeminate gay man, it can be perceived to be easier romantically to transition into women because you're going to be able to attract the type of men that you're attracted to, because it's hard for effeminate gay men to find success in the gay world. And so transition is a coping mechanism for like that. Now, in the other case, now that is the minority of cases, but that would be the more classical scenario where the young boy is like 4 or 5 years old. They're wearing dresses. They're playing with Barbies, and they're having that early cross-sex ideation. That's the minority of cases. And the other case, you are attracted to women, but like I said, that attraction becomes internalized. You come out later. There's often no signs of femininity from a young age, and they're very typical masculine interests like computer programming, hobbies. It's very common to go into like the military. And these are also the trans women you see who have been married with 3 children and they transition at 50 years old, but they have this lifelong secretive history of cross-dressing. But you also see this in like, it's not just like, oh, you're either 50 years old, late transitioner, or you're like this young boy. You also start seeing this in the phenomenon of teenage boys, particularly boys who are interested in like anime, computers, and they get into a lot of like online pornography and things. And so this is a pretty diverse phenomenon. But that's kind of the general theory, but it's very controversial because the mainstream narrative says that gender identity comes first. You're born with it. And then all this kink stuff is a coping mechanism to deal with that innate repressed gender identity. Whereas this model flips it around and says like, no, it's your sexuality that comes first and is the primary psychological foundation. And then the gender identity develops later as a downstream psychological byproduct of the underlying sexuality. But that's controversial because people don't want to say that a trans woman's identity is fundamentally driven from their underlying sexuality. They want to say that it's this innate, immutable core identity. So it's very controversial.
And sexuality and sexual feelings are a powerful driver of behavior, and it makes sense that sexuality would drive sort of a sense of identity, and not the other way around. So let me see if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly. That the bulk of men who transition do so out of this sense of feeling feminine, being attracted to the feminine, internalizing it as feminine, and then going on to believe that this really means they want to be a woman, and so they go there?
Yes. And also, I want to make the distinction between sort of having dysphoria such that you like literally think that you are the opposite sex. That's much less common. That's called cross-sex ideation, where you like literally have like a cross-sex identity that is mismatched to some degree, which is far less common than what's actually more common, which is not that you identify as the opposite sex, but you're very envious of the opposite sex. So often this phenomenon is called the envy-desire phenomenon, where you are very confused about whether you are attracted to women or whether you're envious of her and you want to be her. Okay. So that sort of envy-desire phenomenon is like, and then you couple that sort of, you're very envious, you're jealous of women because they get to look pretty, they get to wear the clothes that you want to wear. You're like envious of the role that they get to play sexually. Like maybe you wish you were in a more submissive role in the bedroom. And so now you couple that also with a general dissatisfaction with the male gender role. You see this in
Mhm.
like young men who, um, they've been sold this idea that masculinity is toxic, that if you're a young, straight white man, then you are like the worst person in the world. You're this
Mhm.
oppressor. And you sort of see a lot of young men who just don't really see a lot of like benefit of being a
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of insecurity about measuring up to these standards of masculinity. Like they're not like alpha men. They're maybe never had a girlfriend. They're nerdy. They're also, I didn't mention this before, but this is very correlated with being on the autism spectrum. These sorts of um, atypical gender confusions are highly correlated with being on the autism spectrum.
Really?
And that's true both for the boys and the girls, maybe
And
more
why
so
is
with the
that? Is it because they have difficulties sort of understanding or grasping the idea of their sexuality and how it relates to gender, or why would it be more prevalent in autistic men and women?
That is a good question. I don't think we fully understand that connection. Like, what is like the mechanism? I've heard some people speculate that autism involves deficiencies or differences in self-referential processing. So there's some sort of like difference in how you process um, internally self-perceived perceptions or like internally self-perceived feelings, and so that sort of self-referential differences in cognitive processing, it could theoretically translate into ha- like how you interpret your own sexual feelings. Because again, a lot of this comes down to this auto component,
Right.
this auto sexual, this like somehow like normal healthy sexual development is you're attracted to something that's not yourself. Like you're attracted to some other
Correct.
person. It's other oriented, but somehow, some way, um, this paraphilia, it's like some brain mechanism goes wrong where essentially that normal other oriented attraction gets turned inward somehow. So there's some
Mhm.
sort of inversion, and like, but this is all speculative. There's not a lot of research on
But it
this.
makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense because one of the hallmarks of autism, even high functioning, is an inability to sort of integrate what's happening all around you, um, as and what it has to do with you. So what is happening? How do I respond? There's that kind of confusion that I see in there. It would make perfect sense if they had that same confusion about themselves internally.
Right.
Now, you had mentioned pornography and cannabis. How do those play into all that? Again, it's the chicken or the egg thing.
Right. Well, I mean, speaking to the cannabis real quick, for me in particular, like I've been struggling with cannabis use for many decades. And for me, how it tied into the autogynephilia and the cross dressing and the pornography is insofar as I had always perceived it to be some form of aphrodisiac. So it kind of amplifies sensations, particularly physical bodily sensations. So for me, that was just like straightforward connection
Mhm.
to the sexual component. And then to your other more broader question about this chicken and the egg, like what comes first, because there are some people who are in this space of being critical of these particular ideologies. They want to sort of say that, like, well, if there was no pornography whatsoever, then this whole transgender thing would have never got off the ground. And like, this is all entirely caused by pornography. And I think that's taking it a little too
Yeah.
far.
If you've ever tried to get therapy, it can be hard to even get in the door. The long wait lists, the confusing insurance stuff, the high out of pocket costs, it's enough to make anyone give up. But your mental health shouldn't be that hard to take care of. Rula is changing that. Rula is a healthcare provider group that's making high quality mental health care accessible for everyone. With Rula, it's easy to find a licensed therapist who fits your needs. They'll ask you a few questions, match you with someone who accepts your insurance, and let you schedule right away. You can even have your first appointment as soon as tomorrow, and it's affordable. Most people pay just $15 per session, and many pay even less, depending on their insurance. Plus, Rula stays with you throughout your journey. They care about real progress, not just checking a box. Thousands have already trusted Rula to support them on their journey toward improved mental health and overall well-being. Head on over to rula.com/DRMEG to get started today. After you sign up, they'll ask how you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. That's RULA.com/DRMEG. Take the first step toward better mental health today. You deserve quality care from someone who cares.
There is a nature-nurture component here. And some people have noticed, there's not strong evidence for this, but some people have noticed anecdotally that autogynephilia and transgenderism seems to run in families, at least for males. So if you have a boy that has gender dysphoria, it's very common for the father to have some degree of it as well. So like I said, there's not strong evidence for this, but also the fact that you see this pattern of gender incongruence emerge cross-culturally in many different times in histories, with and without exposure to pornography, particularly like the modern forms of online pornography. Because I've heard stories of other men with these issues who they were raised in like some fundamentalist like Mormon community back in like the 70s, and they didn't have the internet, they didn't have pornography, so and they clearly developed the same symptomology, the like same pattern, the same syndrome, the same milestones at a very young age prior to puberty. So there does seem to be a sense in which like this stuff can arise independently of these environmental but what I would say is that I do think while there is a nature component, I do think the nurture side, the environment, the pornography, and the modern forms of, I think it exacerbates things, and it takes what may have just been like a seed, and it like adds accelerant to that fuel. It escalates it, and and maybe there's a latent potentiality, but without these sorts of modern forms of pornography and culture and the zeitgeist and all these environmental factors, it would have never elaborated into the extent that it did. You would have just been able to keep it manageable. You would have been able to compartmentalize it. You would be able to integrate it into a healthy form of sexuality. But I think that's the danger now, is that the toxic environment is taking like the germ of something and spinning it completely out of control. Particularly with like the total lack of gatekeeping. You can just walk down to the clinic and like fill out some paperwork and get your hormones, or you can order them off the internet these days. I mean, there's no gatekeeping anymore. Whereas like 40 years ago, it would have been very hard to like go through the proper channels.
And I think that when you're talking about something as complex, okay, as you experienced in the pre-transitioning and then the transitioning experience, that for us to say, oh yeah, this is who you are and this is the way you're born, don't repress anything, let's make you a woman. That is so cruel. And I wonder if there's a sense where we're the kind of society or parents or whatever, where we want to pathologize everything. In other words, if we see somebody who lives differently or wants something different, we immediately say something's wrong. We need the answer. Oh, by the way, here's the answer: transition. But to me, that's cruel, because that isn't an answer to it doesn't address the problem. It doesn't address the underlying kind of issue. And so, as a pediatrician, I get kids coming in, different ages, and of course, different parents. Let's say I have a 14 or 15-year-old kid come in. This happens and say, I'm trans. I'm a girl. I want to be a guy, or I'm a guy and I want to be a girl. And the parent says, well, I don't really know what to do because I want him to accept himself. So therefore I should encourage him to transition. Or the other parent that says, I just have no idea what's happening. And so I'm going to say, no, this is all in your head. Forget about it. What would you say if you were in my situation?
Yeah, this is a very complicated issue, and it's very difficult for parents, I think, because a lot of the narratives form a kind of emotional manipulation. Like the standard line was that you take your kid to the doctor's office, and the kid says, hey, I'm trans, and then the doctor tells the parent, hey, would you rather have a dead son or a trans daughter or something like this, with the implication being that if you don't give these protocols to these children, and these are the protocols that they're demanding, if we don't give the patient, the child patient, what they want, then they're going to self-delete in some respect. Right. So it's very important to get clear on the actual evidence, the systematic evidence reviews on whether or not that claim is true, that if you do not provide these affirming protocols, then that child is at an increased risk of self-deletion. Mm-hmm. And so, because that is the primary argument for why these protocols are medically necessary. Because, historically, it's like, okay, well, you seem to have a psychiatric issue. Like, you're not going to deteriorate as an organism and die tomorrow. If it's not like cancer, where if you don't treat it, it's going to deteriorate. These are psychological issues, but they've been made medically necessary issues under the threat of, well, this is going to escalate in terms of your mental health to self-deletion. And so that is why this is medically necessary.
And that's a pretty tough thing to say to a parent. I mean, because if it's not true, it's highly manipulative.
Right.
Because parents will do anything to keep their kid alive. Right. But if it isn't true, now the research that I've read, and I've tried to read from all different sides, is that it's not true, that suicide and suicidality among kids who don't transition is higher. What is your take on that?
From looking at the systematic evidence reviews that have come out over the past 5 to 10 years, my sense is that, first of all, we need to distinguish between the actual successful rates of completion of the suicide, which is different than ideation itself, which is often a cry for help. And so if you look at the actual statistics on whether or not gender dysphoric children successfully go through with it, which indicates a higher degree of concrete planning, that statistic is not any higher than the general population of children with other mental health issues. And then at the other case where you look at they have these higher rates of ideation, if you control for all the comorbid mental health issues that these gender dysphoric because these gender dysphoric kids, they don't just have, hey, I don't like my gender. They're also depressed, they have anxiety, they have autism, they have OCD, they have eating disorders, they have trauma, they have sexual abuse. If you sort of control for all that, then the suicidal ideation is expected for children who have those sorts of comorbidities with their mental health. And so the idea is that, all these other mental health issues like their depression, anxiety, all this stuff is caused by their gender dysphoria. So if we treat the gender thing, then somehow their mental health is all going to improve. But the actual systematic evidence review shows that with these interventions, over the course of the long term, like 5 years, 10 years, it doesn't seem to improve the mental health along these other metrics. Now, they'll use this other misleading statistics saying they don't regret their transition, so therefore this is a good medical outcome. Well, you can not express a regret, particularly if it's tied into your identity, but that's different from objective measures of like mental health, psychosocial functioning, like, avoiding drug addiction, like holding a job, like these more objective measures of like mental health, like there's very weak evidence that it improves that in the long term. And a lot of the studies showing that it does improve things, there's no long-term follow-up. So they follow up after 1 year, but they don't follow up after 5 years. And so without that long-term follow-up data, it's very hard to objectively say that we have strong evidence that these protocols do. They might, but we just don't have strong evidence for that.
Yeah.
Because there's so many conflating factors. A lot of these studies are done poorly. They don't have good follow-up data. There's just like conflicting measurements of like what determines a successful, like what determines. And there's also some data sets that show that, for example, in Sweden, where they have national records for literally everyone who's been transitioned, that the mental health rates and suicidal ideation actually goes up after these protocols. So on the whole, the evidence is very mixed and contradictory about whether these protocols actually do the thing that they're stated to do, which is to improve mental health, improve dysphoria, all these things. And it's become more of a question of like autonomy. Okay, well, even if it doesn't like improve their mental health objectively, like they want this. It's their right to this. Their right to bodily autonomy. Their right to these things, because it's become part of their political identity, and sort of like denying like their core part of who they are. But it's like, okay, well, you're 13 years old. Like, you've had this identity for 6 months. Like, are we really sure that there's not these other factors?
So what is going on in our culture that I often say we've normalized crazy, and I'm not going to use that right here though. But what is it in our culture that is so extreme that it will take a child and who comes and says, I think I really want to be a girl. And then 6 months later, I think I really want to be a girl. And the culture said, okay, take him to, a gender dysphoria clinic. He really needs to change. Why are we pushing it so much? What is the benefit in pushing a kid to start taking hormones, interrupt puberty, put him at risk for all of these other medical health issues, physical issues? What is it in our culture that pushes for that rather than saying, I get it. You cross-dress, you're confused. You've got these things going on. Let's just pause and try to figure that out and try to understand you rather than start pumping you with hormones. Why are we doing this?
I think, so there's this one conservative writer, I think her name is Allie Beth Stuckley, I believe. She's like a Christian. I think she's a podcast. But she wrote this book recently, I think in 2024, called Toxic Empathy. And I think this comes down to the heart of the issue, where like all these parents, like everyone, pushing for these protocols, like often it's like they just feel really bad for these children. They are motivated to do what's right. They're like motivated by these stories, these anecdotes. You used to see these, little mini documentaries on like, Channel 6 News or 60 Minutes. And it paints this really compelling story. And you sort of see these amazing transformations anecdotally, like before this, the little depressed boy, now they're like their happy, true, authentic self. I think it's very easy, as a liberal society, as a society that's very empathetic, to really want to do its best. And then when you couple that with a particular academic theory of sex and gender and how sex and gender relate to each other that came out of the university, came out of queer theory, came out of these sorts of progressive research institutions, you started sort of like see how our culture started to decouple these questions of sexual identity from like our actual embodiment, to the point where like it became possible intellectually, philosophically, to even pose the question, like, would it be possible for a man to be born in the body of like a woman and vice versa? Like like 100 years ago, like conceptually, like no one would be able to like conceptualize that question, because our notions of the self were not so individualized, they weren't so psychologized, they weren't so therapeuticized. So now that we live in this culture where it's all about individual expression, it's about your therapeutic self, your psychological self, like who we are fundamentally is like we're these isolated units,
Mhm.
egos, and that it just starts to get into this question of like, okay, well, what if that was like separated from the body, and then um you suppose that's possible. So okay, well, here's this case, this child, this person, they have this situation. I feel really bad for them, and we can't propose of any alternative solution on how to deal with this, because that's been the narrative. It's like, well, it's easier to change the body than it is
Yeah.
the brain.
Yes.
So there,
Well,
accordingly,
and it's a lot more work for the person who's helping the kid or the
right,
adult. You know, it's easier to just say, "Okay, let's do this," and it takes about a year, and then you'll heal. Then it does to really get in the nitty-gritty with somebody and say, "Let's sort of untangle all of this complexity," which is gonna, and I wonder too if a lot of practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists don't know how to do that, because this is
right.
relatively new. I mean, 10 years old. Um, let's talk about your faith. We only have a couple more minutes, and I'm taking you long over the time you agreed to come on. So I really appreciate your generosity. Um, you had a conversion to Catholicism. Now, was that because you felt like something's wrong, life is bad, God will cure me? Or is it something that came out of a lot of pain that you've experienced? Can you talk about your spiritual journey?
Sure. So I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up Christian. I rejected all that in high school. I was like a hardcore atheist for many, many years. Then I got into like the New Age and Eastern philosophies, and then just exploring things spiritually. And that led me up and through my detransition, where after I detransitioned, a lot of those same underlying desires for cross dressing came back, because I had no longer been suppressing my testosterone. And so the erotic libido for the testosterone came back once the testosterone came back into my system. So I was all of a sudden presented with these questions of like, struggling how to manage my sexuality, these questions of, you know, dealing with these desires, how to integrate them into my life, or how to repress them. And so basically, long story short, I had like a crisis of conscience where, I really felt a strong conviction that if I want to get right with God, then I need to cut out this cross-dressing stuff, cut out the fetishism and all these things. And then that gave me a spiritual awakening to the truth of the Catholic Church's position on sexuality, because I had always been interested in Catholicism, but because I grew up liberal, because I grew up very affirming of LGBT, not just on the trans issue, but on like the issue of like, same-sex attraction, I always struggled with the Church's teachings on sexual ethics. And so when I was coming to terms with like my own disordered forms of sexuality, my own disordered inclinations, I kind of had a epiphany essentially, where I realized like the truth of what the Catholic Church was teaching, as far as like, here is the ultimate normative ideal. This is the guideline for how sexuality ought to properly be expressed in the context of like a loving sacramental marriage for the purposes of procreation and the unitive bonding. So that kind of really was like the final impetus intellectually for me to come around to accept like the church's teachings, was on this issue of sexuality. And so from there, this was earlier this year, so I got confirmed in the Catholic Church this past Easter. And so from there, it's been this process of coming into the church, healing, particularly in the sacraments, finding that sort of ground, because I've also come to realize that there's a spiritual component to a lot of these addictions and disordered forms of sexuality, where there's a sort of inner spiritual restlessness where,
Mhm.
and my answer to that in my life has been hedonism, like that sort of God-shaped hole in my heart that
Mhm.
makes me, long for satisfaction and peace and contentment. Like I had always filled that hole with like pursuing pleasure, which is like
Mhm.
it's kind of like the main. There's you can pursue pleasure, you can pursue power, you can pursue fame. Well, for me, it was always pleasure. So whether it's through drugs or sexuality or pornography, all these things, and so I've come to realize that like um, a lot of these coping mechanisms I had came out of that spiritual restlessness, and so finding that there's like this ultimate transcendent source of peace has allowed me to begin that healing journey. But I'll just be honest with the listeners, like I haven't turned into a saint. Like I still have temptations. I still have struggles because we all
Of
have what's
course.
called concupiscence. We all are born with these disordered desires. And like, that's something we struggle with until the day we
Yeah.
die.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the fallacies of, sometimes people perceiving Christianity, whether it's Protestantism or Catholicism or whatever, is that once, God takes over your life, all this vanishes. Well, not really. What happens is God comes in and helps you deal with all of that stuff. Um,
Right.
for you didn't turn to Catholicism to sort of deny who you were and sort of, wrap that old person up in a box and set him aside. You came into Catholicism saying, you know what? I've been really confused. I've tried this and this and this and this, and I need something deeper to really help me. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, going for something deeper, something that is going to provide a sense of peace. Because whenever you're pursuing pleasure, pursuing hedonism, like you sort of like get habituated to that stimulus. You need more and more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Jesus, with Christianity, with like religion and spirituality, like you sort of hit a bedrock in terms of like seeking, like you're like not going to develop a tolerance to Jesus. You're not going to get like a you're
You know what? That's one of the best lines I've ever heard. You're not going to develop a tolerance to Jesus. You're absolutely right.
right.
Because the more you want from him, the more he gives and the more satisfaction and peace you get.
Right. Yeah, he's that spiritual water that we don't get thirsty after we never get filled up. And so I think and I see this all around us in our culture, which I think is why we're starting to see a rise, and particularly younger generations turning to these more traditional forms of Christianity and religion, because they're seeing the spiritual emptiness in our culture. They're seeing, the hookup culture, the pornography, the like emptiness of consumerism and drugs and pleasure seeking and entertainment, and it's all vanity.
Mhm.
It's like and once you realize that like there's so much vanity and just like emptiness and like you really start craving something deeper, something that's transcultural, something that's trans historical, something that's eternal, something solid, traditional. That's not just going to get like updated next week as our culture evolves. Like, so I think people really crave that.
Right. Well, and you articulate it so beautifully. Our guest, Ray Alex Williams, has been through transitioning to a woman and detransitioning and finding faith and finding who he really is and who God really is and how God really has met him and brought him huge peace, not just covered over who he is, but walked into who Ray is and helped him with that. Ray, I really appreciate you coming here today. And I think this has just been so important for parents who are listening to know how to approach their kids and how to understand something that really is pretty perplexing to parents, and it's very confusing. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to have been able to talk to you about this issue. This is a really important issue, and I appreciate the work you're doing because yeah, parents need to hear more of the truth than just like the canned answers that they hear from the mainstream media.
Absolutely. So how can people find you?
If you just search Ray X Williams on YouTube, that's where I have a lot of my content on topic. On Twitter, Ray X Williams. I have the Substack as well where I write about these things. So yeah, pretty much you can find me on most social media under the handle Ray X Williams.
Perfect. I really, really appreciate you coming on and doing not only a great interview, but really helping so many people that need help. Hey parents, I'm Dr. Meg Meeker, and if you're ready for real solutions to your parenting problems from a pediatrician, join my Parenting Great Kids community today.
There's a reason so many parents trust Dr. Meg Meeker. Now her courses, parenting forum, and trusted answers are all in one place, the PGK Insider Community. Join free at meekerparenting.com.